Welcome to the Australia Institute's Economics Academy. I'm Richard Denniss, Chief Economist at the Australia Institute.
And I'm Matt Grudnoff, the Senior Economist.
Today we're going to talk about when markets don't work well. So to recap a bit, economics is about the efficient allocation of scarce resources. And we've talked about that before. And one way to organise ourselves to answer the question of what to produce and how to produce and who to give it to, one way is to do that through markets, through consumers and producers coming together and swapping stuff for money. Markets work pretty well for doing some things sometimes. And in a previous episode, we've talked about when the sometimes is. But sometimes markets are just a terrible idea for solving some problems. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So, Matt, is there anything that you think, I would never want a market to answer that question?
Well, should they pull the plug on my life support machine? Perhaps that's
Who's they?
Well, the market.
Why is that? Who should decide that?
Well, that's a very good question. I'd rather that, people I trust, my loved ones, to make that kind of decision, rather than is Matthew's future expected earnings greater or less than the price of keeping Matt on life support?
All right, well, let's interrogate that a bit. Let's imagine that you are on life support, having had a traumatic economics accident, and you're laying there on the machine that goes beep, and your loved ones are there, and they're trying to decide whether to pull the pin or not. Doesn't it depend how much money they have to spend keeping you alive? Won't that affect their decision? I know they love you, but gee, if you're costing them $1 million a day.
That's true. Perhaps, I believe in medical care being paid by the government, particularly in that kind of situation. And I would hope that cost wasn't a major part. But I suppose it wouldn't just be my loved ones making that decision. I think that healthcare professionals should help make that decision as well, not based on how much it costs to keep me alive, but rather my chances of recovery or something similar.
So if your kids go into a shop to decide what they should get you for your birthday or Christmas, that's the kind of decision that you're happy for them to make. You're also happy for them to make decisions about, whether it's time to pull the pin or not. Where else might you want something other than money, something other than a market force to answer these questions?
Well, there are lots of areas, I suppose, where we begin to wonder whether markets are the best thing. So surrogate wombs, body parts. Should kidneys be available for sale?
Right, okay.
I have a bit of a problem with, eBay for kidneys, where you dial up a third world country and you can order a kidney.
Right, so I've got 2 kidneys and someone wants to buy one off me. You don't think we should let the market do that?
That's right.
Why not?
I think there are ethical issues.
Interventionist nanny status.
I am a nanny status.
How come?
Because I think that there are all kinds of perverse incentives. So I think that if you allowed the market to decide whether or not kidneys would be sold, I think you would suddenly find that a lot of poor people were going without a kidney.
Right. So when it comes to the decision to get a tattoo, I can take a risk. When it comes to the decision to go bungee jumping, you let me do that. But if I want to sell my kidney to someone, you want to step in.
That's exactly right.
Okay, so how do you, as an economist or as a citizen, draw that line?
Well, and that's a really good question.
Thank you.
You're welcome. It doesn't happen every time, but in this case it did.
So can you give me a really good answer? How do you draw the line?
Yeah, look, I think that the line isn't obvious. The line is grey, and that some people will have a problem with some things having the market work out whether it should work, and will have no problem with them having the market, and some people will have a big problem. And that's really a question for society, rather than just blanketly deciding, well, the market should always do it.
Okay, so if we were going to kind of think up some rules, and you say there's a grey line, I agree entirely. In Australia you donate blood, in America you sell blood. Different countries make different decisions about whether to use markets or not. And over time, we change our mind about some things. But Matt, are there any criteria What are the sort of things that you think about when you're trying to answer the question, is this the kind of thing that you think a market is good at?
Well, I suppose it's things where there are long-term consequences, or there's a real chance of exploitation. These are the kinds of things that you would have to consider whether or not you got a market to do it. Because a market, all it does is it's a very blunt instrument for allocating resources. And basically, if you're willing to pay, you have the willingness and ability to pay. We talked about that in an earlier episode. If you have the money and you're willing to spend it, then somebody will supply it. Whether or not that's to do with equity, whether or not that's to do with exploitation, the market doesn't care about that.
So to recap, markets are a way to help us efficiently allocate scarce resources. And hundreds of years ago, it was common around the world for there to be a market in human slaves. It was the dominant form of production in North America, for example. Now, there's still slavery taking place in the world today, but most people, certainly most people in rich countries like Australia, think slavery is wrong. How do we come up with decisions about what's right and wrong? Which chapter in the economics textbook kind of helps us here?
Oh, well, let me go back to our very first episode where we talked about positive statements and normative statements, where we talked about the fact that economics doesn't tell you what you should do. Economics talks about facts and how things work. And what you're delving into there is not the place for economics. Whether we should do something is a matter for society.
So we can't ask economists everything?
We can't ask economists for everything. Sometimes economists like to be asked about everything. Sometimes economists want to expand their kingdom, the area of their domain, and say, well, that's part of economics. But I think people should resist that, and they should ask the question, well, are we talking about the efficient allocation of scarce resources? And if we're not, then we don't have to listen to economists.
So most people in a country like Australia think that when you show up in an emergency ward at a hospital, it shouldn't be your willingness and ability to pay that counts. And most people, I'm pretty confident, most people don't think that, people think that slavery should be ever used as part of an efficient production process. But let's talk more about the grey areas. I mean, we do have people who donate kidneys. I can donate a kidney to a stranger. And if I donate a kidney to a stranger, I'll probably lower my life expectancy. My body has 2 kidneys for a reason. Is it okay for me to donate one, but it's not okay for me to sell one?
Yeah, absolutely.
How come?
Because the exploitation part of it is taken out, I think. So you're not encouraging people who are desperate for cash to go out and make a short-term decision to get that cash that has long-term consequences.
Right. So if people want to make choices that help other people that cause some detriment to themselves, from your point of view, that's different from when people are under enormous pressure and have no options. You're allowed to buy a kidney or a lung off them.
Absolutely.
Okay, what about other domains where markets won't work? What about the environment? You often hear people say that market forces done well can fix all of our environmental problems. Is that true?
Well, it could, but it has a very patchy record, shall we say, in success. So the environment is a great area where externalities exist, and we talked a bit about externalities earlier.
So remind me what an externality is again?
So an externality is where there's a cost in a transaction. So I'm selling something to you, Richard, and it affects somebody out there who's not a part of our transaction. So the classic example is, say you had a paint factory, right? And it was making paint and selling it to people, but it was dumping all of its excess, very toxic chemicals in the river.
So you make the paint and you sell the paint to me. I'm happy with the cheap paint. You're happy with the price I pay you, and you're tipping all the spare paint chemicals into the river.
And the people enjoying the river downstream can no longer enjoy it. So they've been impacted.
They get free paint.
Or paint chemicals, maybe.
And they're complaining, you reckon?
And they're complaining. But they've been impacted by our transaction. So that's an externality.
Right. And markets don't work when there's externalities. What if the people who are downstream, if they really liked their fresh water so much, why don't they pay you to not pollute them?
Well, that's where some people have suggested that you could...
You mean Ronald Coase, who won the Nobel Prize?
That's right, yes. Nobel Prize winning economist.
So the people that get polluted can pay the polluter to stop polluting.
That's right. But in reality, it just doesn't work like that.
Why not?
Well, it's to do with property rights and whether or not people can band together and they have the information and the ability to go and pay for these sorts of things.
So when we've got environmental problems, you often hear people talking about market-based solutions, like a carbon price, for example. Yep. Does that mean markets can't solve environmental problems?
No, not at all. So markets can be used to solve problems. They just can't be used to solve all of the problems. And what we need to do is we need to pick and choose for when it works well and when it doesn't.
So we could put a price on pollution to discourage people from using so much coal-fired power, but we could still regulate new houses to stop them being incredibly inefficient.
That's exactly right. So insulation's a great example. So people don't tend to put nearly enough insulation in a house because it's an upfront cost, and a cheaper house is better, and they're not necessarily thinking of the long-term gain in that particular case. So prices and markets don't necessarily work well, and in those particular cases, the most efficient way, and one that most economists would suggest, is that the government comes in and regulates.
So regulation isn't evil? I thought you were an economist.
No, regulation is not evil at all. And in fact, there's nothing in economics that says that regulation is evil, and quite the opposite. When markets fail, and we've established earlier that a failing market is a non-perfectly competitive market, i.e. all markets. When markets fail, there is a role for regulation, and economics suggests that there's a role for regulation.
Well, actually on that, you can go up a level. I mean, we talk about property rights. I can claim this pen's mine, but actually I didn't buy it. But I certainly bought my pants and my shoes, and we know that when I go to a shop to buy them, the things are theirs until I pay to take them. So we have what we call property rights, and you need to have property rights for Matt and I to be able to exchange things. Because what Matt's actually, give me my pen back, what we're actually doing when we swap money for things is exchanging property rights. I buy something from Matt, I now have the right, it's mine, everyone knows it's mine. And you hear a lot of people talk about free markets and how free markets don't need regulation. But of course you can't have a market unless someone has come and created all the regulations first. Unless the law spells out property, unless the law spells out what happens if Matt steals from me, we can't actually have a market where we swap stuff until we've actually created regulation. So much of what we hear about how markets are good and regulation's bad ignores a very important reality, and that is that every market you've ever heard of is regulated. It's impossible to have a deregulated market because all markets rely on some form of property rights or some form of government intervention to help them. So we're talking about when markets don't work well. They don't work well when there's big power imbalances. Let's do another example of that. I'm driving from Sydney to Perth, and I'm on the Nullarbor plane, and there's one petrol station, and I stop, and it wants to charge me $20 a litre for petrol. Is that a rip-off?
That's outrageous.
But I don't have to buy the petrol.
That's exactly right.
It's a free market.
That's right. So what we have there is a monopoly. So there's no other petrol stations around. It's a geographic monopoly, what we call a geographic monopoly. It's a monopoly because it's the only one in a particular area. But it's a monopoly nonetheless, and monopolies, we know, can charge a higher price quite happily, and people will have to pay because you can't get your petrol from anywhere else.
Well, let's back that up. When we talked about when markets work well, it's because markets work well when there's lots of buyers and lots of sellers and there's substitutes. Mm-hmm. But if you've got the only monopoly petrol station halfway between two towns, not only aren't there lots of sellers, but I've got no substitute if you want to charge me $10 a litre.
You can always walk across a Nullarbor.
That's the substitute.
That's the substitute.
So how do we cope with that? Like, we know monopolies exist. What have economists got to say? Do we just give up if there's going to be a monopoly?
Well, normally we would say that the government should intervene and force more competition into the market. So there's no longer a monopoly. So there are competitors. So the government might give cheap land for another petrol station to set up in a similar location, and so therefore to kind of try and break that monopoly.
Wouldn't it be just simpler to regulate them and make sure they couldn't rip you off?
Yeah, you could do that. You could force the petrol station to sell at a certain price.
And what's a natural monopoly? What's so natural about some monopolies?
Yeah, so there are certain weird, strange goods where the most efficient outcome is a monopoly. So normally we would
Hang on, let's back this up, because in perfect competition we had lots of buyers and lots of sellers was the perfect outcome.
Yep.
Now you're jumping around saying that we can only have one supplier sometimes, and that's good.
Yeah, that's where the infrastructure costs are so huge and so massive that it's just inefficient for somebody else to set up that infrastructure. So take electricity poles and wires, for example. What we could do is we could say, well, we'll open distribution of electricity up to lots of different companies.
So Richard's wires and Matt's wires.
Yep. And so lots of firms, Richard's company, electricity company or distribution company and my company, could connect every house in Australia to electricity. That is, you could have multiple poles and wires going into your house, and if you decide to use Richard, well, he'll turn on his network, and if you decide to use me, it'll turn on my network. But the problem with that is the cost of setting up that infrastructure is so massive that the price that Richard and I would charge is far more than we would if we were just a normal monopoly.
So sometimes it literally just makes more sense to have one set of poles and wires or one set of water pipes, one set of sewerage pipes, and then either have the government own it or regulate the price.
Yeah, so economics says that either the government should own that natural monopoly or it should be heavily regulated, because monopolies do rip customers off.
All right, so we're talking about when markets don't work well, and when there's power imbalances. Well, I can see plenty of examples of that. When we care about some environmental things, where it's just too hard to invent a market, got monopoly and natural monopoly. The other one that I think is important is what's called a public good.
So what's a public good, Richard?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Matt. So when I go and buy a pen, I buy a pen because I wanted a pen and I thought it'd be useful to use the pen, and I get most of the value of using a pen. But not all goods have the attributes of a pen. We want people, for example, to buy vaccinations. Why do we want them to buy vaccinations? Because when they vaccinate themselves, they actually protect other people. We want people to educate their kids, and 5-year-old kids aren't willing or able to pay for their education. And the fact that a kid's parents aren't willing or able to pay for a kid's education doesn't mean that we don't all benefit from every kid getting an education.
A well-educated society.
A well-educated society. I mean, sadly, there's nearly 9 billion people on the earth at the moment, and a lot of them never spent much time in school because a lot of people in a lot of countries can't afford to go to school. And what that means is that someone with the intellect of Albert Einstein is literally out there doing some menial job at the moment because they never got taught to read and they never got taught maths, and no one ever figured out how smart they were. So we can all benefit from people consuming some things, and in economics we call them public goods. And a public good is quite a different kind of good to a pen or a cup of coffee, because if I've got a pen or I have a good or I have a coffee, then the benefits, it's my pen, I can exclude Matt from benefiting from it. We say it's excludable. And also, if I've got the pen in my hand, Matt can't have it in his hand. It's rivalrous. There's only one pen and we can't both write with it at the same time. But things like vaccinations and things like educating people, once you've educated a person, the benefits accrue to everybody. Of course, some of the benefits accrue to the individual, but a lot of the benefits accrue to everybody. Again, same is true with vaccination, same is true with a lot of public health interventions. So that's why we often see governments providing public schools, providing vaccinations, providing all sorts of public health, not just immunisations, but sewers. Sewers were invented for your neighbours, right? The wonderful thing about a sewer is that it prevents individuals thinking too hard about how much they want to pay for their waste disposal. We all benefit when people use the sewerage system. The point is, when we talk about when markets don't work well, we come up with a pretty big list. When equity is an issue, when power imbalances are an issue, it's very hard for buyers and sellers to negotiate. Someone starving to death will pay a lot of money for food. Someone driving in the middle of nowhere will pay a lot of money for petrol. When there's a big power imbalance, if I'm about to lose my house and Matt wants to buy my kidney, there's an incredible power imbalance in the transaction. So equity really matters for whether or not we think markets work. For a whole bunch of environmental products, environmental services, it's just too hard to organise transactions. Getting 1 million people to pay a polluter to stop polluting, it works well in theory. It doesn't work in practice. It's so much simpler just to regulate and tell Matt not to put his stuff in the river or the atmosphere. Monopolies and natural monopolies are everywhere. And when they exist, we just need to recognise that and regulate them. We can't just talk about the benefits of competition or the benefits of markets. And then there's public goods, which so many of the services that are so important to us, health, education, police, courts, you name it, all sorts of services we all benefit from. So markets can do a good job of allocating some resources sometimes, but there's a very, very long list of times where that's not going to be the case. And while Matt and me and anyone else might disagree about, is it better for people to sell their blood and get $20 for it and go do what they want with $20, or should we just volunteer to provide blood as a community service? Different people in different countries settle on different answers. But what we hope that we've explained to you is you can't just let people say, leave it to the market. Markets are efficient and regulation's not. We need to intervene in all of these situations, and if we do, and we understand why, we can get the best of both worlds. We can get efficient markets for things that markets are good at, and we can get good regulation or good provision of service for things they're bad at. We do these things for free because we really love helping people understand economics. But if you can like, share, or subscribe to our service, that'd be great.